She thought he was just another silent, broken, and lonely patient. But when a single word escaped his lips, it unraveled a mystery no one had seen coming. What secrets did his silence hide? And how would his first words change everything? It all began in the sterile hum of the hospital corridors, where nurses moved like cogs in a clock, their crisp white uniforms blending with the pallor of the walls. Elise Parker, a young nurse with a kind smile and an unwavering commitment to her patients, had just finished her shift. Her legs ached, and her mind buzzed with exhaustion. But the weight of her duty never diminished her resolve. As she rounded the corner into the rehabilitation wing, her gaze landed on room 217, the room of the silent patient. The man everyone called Mr. Din had been admitted months earlier after a near-fatal accident. No family had come forward, no records of his past life surfaced. He was a mystery locked in silence. Elise couldn't explain why she felt so drawn to him. Perhaps it was the way his deep, attentive eyes seemed to absorb the world, as if it held answers only he could decipher. Or maybe it was his resilience, that quiet strength in his refusal to give up, even when no one else seemed to notice. "Good afternoon, Mr. Din," Elise greeted softly as she entered the room. He slowly turned his head, acknowledging her with a slight movement. Silence hung between them, but Elise had grown accustomed to it. She believed communication didn't always depend on words. She moved around the room, adjusting the blinds to let in the golden light of the late afternoon. "It's a beautiful evening out there," she said, not expecting a reply. "One of those evenings that make you think tomorrow might bring something special." Mr. Din watched her, his expression neutral, but his eyes subtly alert. As she checked his vitals, Elise noticed a small notebook on the bedside table. Its pages were blank except for a faint scribble in one corner. She hesitated before asking, "Do you like to write?" He didn't react, but she felt the question hang in the air. For weeks, she continued her visits, each time offering small acts of kindness, a book she thought he might enjoy, fresh flowers to brighten the room, or simply her sincere, unhurried presence. Each time, his silence spoke volumes, though its meaning remained elusive. Elise's dedication didn't go unnoticed by her colleagues. One evening, as she was preparing Mr. Din's medications, her friend and fellow nurse, Carla, stopped by the station. "You spend a lot of time with him," Carla said, raising an eyebrow. Well, you know." Elise didn't look up. "A lost cause," Carla said hesitantly, lowering her voice. "The doctors don't think he'll ever speak again, or walk. He's trapped in there, wherever there is." Elise closed the medicine cabinet with more force than necessary. "No one is a lost cause, Carla. And you'd be surprised what kindness can achieve." Carla shrugged but didn't argue. That was one of the things Elise prided herself on most, her ability to see hope where others saw nothing. One afternoon, Elise brought a set of watercolor paints and placed them on the table next to Mr. Din's bed. "I thought maybe you'd like to try painting," she said as she set up a small easel and paper. "You don't have to be Picasso. Just let your hands do the talking." At first, he didn't move. His expression remained as impassive as ever. But Elise noticed a flicker of curiosity in his gaze. She left the room to attend to other patients, hoping she wasn't wasting her time. Hours later, when she returned, she caught her breath. On the paper was a simple splash of color, shades of blue and green blending like the ocean meeting the sky. It was rough, unrefined, but it was something. "Did you do this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mr. Din didn't nod, but his hand rested near the paintbrush. A silent admission. Elise smiled, her chest tightening with emotion. "It's beautiful." For the first time, she saw a glimmer of something in his expression, pride, perhaps, or the faintest hint of redemption. From that moment on, painting became their unspoken language. Each day, Elise brought new materials, different colors, various brushes, even textured paper. Mr. Din's paintings evolved, becoming more intricate, though they remained abstract. Yet, there was an undeniable transformation in the room. "Do you ever think about what these paintings mean?" she asked one day, holding up a work with fiery hues of red and yellow. He tilted his head slightly, his brows furrowed in a thoughtful expression. "I think they're stories," she said softly. "Fragments of you, trying to get out." Their eyes met, And for a moment, the silence felt charged, as if something important had passed between them. One evening, as she was leaving his room, she heard a sound that made her stop. It wasn't a word. Not exactly. It was a soft hum. Like a note being tested for the first time. Elise turned, her heart pounding. Mr. Din's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something spark in their depths. Hope. "You're trying, aren't you?" she whispered, stepping closer. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Still, the effort was monumental. Elise reached out, gently placing her hand over his. "It's okay," she said, her voice firm. "Take your time. I'll be here." That night, as she drove home, Elise couldn't shake the feeling that something profound was beginning to unfold. Mr. Din was no longer just a patient, he was a puzzle. A story waiting to be told. And Elise knew, with an unshakable certainty, that his first words would change everything. The next morning, Elise arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. Her steps echoed softly against the polished tiles of the hallway as she made her way to room 217. Something about last night. That hum she'd heard. That flicker of determination in Mr. Din's eyes. Had left her restless. She opened the door and stopped dead. The easel she had set up was empty, but Mr. Din's hands were stained with flecks of crimson and gold. On the wall, taped with medical adhesive, was a new painting. This one was different. It wasn't the abstract swirls of color he usually favored. It was a silhouette. A solitary figure standing on the edge of a cliff, looking out at a stormy sea. Elise felt her chest tighten as she studied it. The painting radiated an almost palpable emotion, loneliness, perhaps, or fear. She turned to Mr. Din, who was watching her intently, his fingers trembling, as if trying to speak. "Did you dream this?" she asked softly. His gaze didn't waver, but his hand moved slowly toward the notebook on the table. Elise quickly grabbed a pen and handed it to him. "Take your time," she said, pulling up a chair. His hand trembled as he wrote a single word on the page. Yes. It was the first word he'd written since arriving at the hospital. And Elise felt a surge of hope. "Dreams can be powerful," she said, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. "Maybe they're trying to tell you something." That small breakthrough, though modest, gave Elise a renewed sense of purpose. Over the following weeks, she spent more time in Mr. Din's room, encouraging him to paint, write, or simply try to express himself in any way possible. One afternoon, as she was helping him adjust his pillows, she asked, "Do you remember anything about the accident, or before?" For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "No memory at all," she pressed gently. He hesitated before writing another word in the notebook. "Fragments." Elise considered his expression thoughtfully. "Fragments are a start. Maybe we can piece them together." That evening, Elise brought a set of flashcards she'd borrowed from the pediatric wing. Each card had a picture on one side and a word on the other. "Let's see if any of these images spark a memory," she said. Flipping through the deck, she showed him a card with a picture of a house, home. Mr. Din frowned but didn't respond. Then, a card with a dog. His lips trembled almost imperceptibly, but he remained silent. The third card showed a lighthouse, its beam cutting through a dark sky. Elise noticed a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "This one?" she asked, holding it closer. He nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of the card. "Do you remember a lighthouse?" He reached for the notebook and wrote two shaky words, "Safe place." The lighthouse became a recurring theme in their conversations. Mr. Din painted it again and again, sometimes standing tall under a clear sky, other times surrounded by violent waves. Each version seemed to tell a different story, but Elise couldn't quite piece them together. One day, as she watched him put the finishing touches on another lighthouse painting, she said, "You know, I think you're trying to tell me something." His hand stilled, and he turned to her, his expression inscrutable. Then, for the first time, he raised his hand to his throat and touched it gently. "You want," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his eyes filled with frustration and determination. Elise felt a surge of emotion. "We'll get there," she promised. "No matter how long it takes, we'll get there." Elise began working with the hospital's speech therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Grace. known for getting results. Are you sure he's ready for this? Grace asked skeptically as they stood outside room 217. I'm sure. Elise replied firmly. Grace sighed but didn't argue. Let's see what we're dealing with. The first session was painfully slow. Grace showed Mr. Din how to practice simple sounds R, E. Oh, but his voice was weak. Barely more than a whisper. Don't get discouraged. Grace told him. This takes time. But it was evident Mr. Din was frustrated. By the end of the session, his hands were clenched into fists, and his face was pale with exertion. Elise stayed after Grace left, pulling a chair close to his bed. I know this is hard, she said softly, but you've already come so far. Don't give up now. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, she thought he might cry. Instead, he reached for the notebook and wrote a single word. Why? Elise hesitated, then said, because I believe in you. And because I think your voice, your story, matters. The word hope became a touchstone in room 217. For Elise, it wasn't just a sign of progress, it was a fragile but powerful promise that Mr. Din's silence wouldn't define him forever. Each day brought a new challenge, and each small victory added another thread to the tapestry of his story. But as Mr. Din gained strength, the weight of the mystery surrounding his past became more apparent. One crisp autumn morning, Elise arrived with a surprise, a stack of postcards she'd found at a local thrift store. Each one depicted a picturesque location, rolling hills, bustling cities, tranquil beaches. She spread them out on the table next to his bed. Watching him carefully, I thought these images might jog a memory, she said, her tone light but filled with hope. Mr. Din examined the postcards in silence, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, his hand stopped on one, the one showing a lighthouse perched on a rocky coast. Waves crashing against the cliffs below. Elise felt a shiver run down her spine. Does this look familiar? He nodded, his hand trembling as he picked up the card. His lips moved, forming no sound, as if he were trying to speak. But no words came out. Take your time, Elise said, placing a comforting hand on his arm. Mr. Din reached for his notebook and wrote 2 words, find us. It became a talisman, a tangible link to a past that seemed just out of reach. In the days that followed, Elise and Mr. Din worked tirelessly to piece together the fragments of his memory. His speech was improving, albeit slowly, and he could now form simple phrases. I see, waves, he murmured one afternoon, his voice hoarse but determined. Waves, Elise repeated, encouraging him to continue. What else? He paused, his eyes distant. Cold, rocks, alone. The word hit Elise like a punch. You were alone. He nodded, his expression strained with emotion. Elise couldn't shake the idea that the lighthouse held the key to unlocking Mr. Din's past. She spent hours researching lighthouses along the coast, searching for one that matched the postcard. Finally, one afternoon, she found it, the Arbor View Lighthouse, a historic beacon perched on the cliffs of a small coastal town. The photo she saw online was identical to Mr. Din's paintings. She printed the image and brought it to him that evening. Does this look familiar? She asked, holding it up. Mr. Din's eyes widened, and he took the photo with trembling hands. He stared at it for a long moment before murmuring, yes. Elise's heart quickened. Do you think this is where you're from? He nodded, clutching the photo between his fingers. The revelation brought a sense of urgency to their work. Elise contacted the hospital's social worker, who agreed to help with the investigation. Together, they combed through missing persons reports, hospital records, and local archives, searching for any mention of a man matching Mr. Din's description near Arbor View. One evening, as Elise was poring over the latest reports at her desk, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from the social worker, maybe a lead. See attached. Elise's hands trembled as she opened the attached file. It was a newspaper article from almost a year ago, detailing the rescue of an unidentified man found unconscious at the bottom of the cliffs near the Arbor View Lighthouse. The article described him as suffering from severe hypothermia and multiple injuries, but offered no further details. No one had come forward to claim him. Elise printed the article and rushed to Mr. Din's room. Does this mean anything to you? She asked, handing him the document. He studied it carefully, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, He nodded. Me, there, he murmured. His voice barely audible. You were there. Elise pressed. Fell, he said. His voice cracking. Dark, cold, tears welled up in Elise's eyes. You fell from the cliffs. He nodded again. His face pale with the effort of speaking. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. But questions remained. Why was he at the lighthouse? What led to his fall? And most importantly, who was he? Really? Elise felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She knew they were getting closer to the truth. But she couldn't help but fear that the answers would bring more pain than solace. One evening, as she was preparing to leave, Mr. Dinh surprised her by speaking without being prompted. Thank you, he said. His voice strained but sincere. Elise turned back, her heart swelling with emotion. What for? He struggled to form the words. For hope. Tears slid down Elise's cheeks as she stepped closer and placed a hand over his. You gave me hope, too, she said softly. The lighthouse was no longer just a symbol, it was a destination. Elise couldn't ignore the pull it exerted on Mr. Dinh or on herself. Every painting he created, every word he managed to murmur, seemed to converge on that solitary beacon on the cliffs. She knew they had to go there. Are you sure this is a good idea? Carla asked, leaning against the nurse's station as Elise packed a bag for the medical excursion. I'm sure. Elise replied without hesitation. Carla frowned. What if this triggers something he's not ready for? You know the doctors think his memory loss could be a defense mechanism. Elise paused, considering her colleague's words. She knew the risks. But she also knew that staying stuck wasn't an option. Mr. Dinh deserved answers. Sometimes healing isn't about staying safe, she said finally. Sometimes it's about facing the truth. The hospital approved her request under strict conditions. The trip would be supervised. And Mr. Dinh would be closely monitored. One cool October morning, Elise helped him into a van, carefully settling him into a wheelchair. As they drove toward the coast, she couldn't help but notice how tightly he gripped the postcard of the lighthouse in his hand, his knuckles white with tension. Are you nervous? She asked softly. He nodded but didn't speak. The lighthouse appeared in the distance just as the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the cliffs in a golden light. It was both beautiful and daunting, standing proudly against the backdrop of crashing waves at the base of the rocks. Elise parked the van and helped him out, guiding him toward the edge of the cliff. He fixed his gaze on the lighthouse, his breath catching, as if the structure might disappear if he blinked. Do you want to get closer? She asked. He nodded, gripping her arm tighter. They approached the lighthouse slowly, the sound of the wind and the waves filling the silence. When they reached the base of the tower, Mr. Dinh stopped abruptly, his eyes widening with recognition. Here, he murmured, his voice trembling. Elise followed his gaze to a weathered bench near the edge of the cliff. Do you remember sitting there? Not sitting, he said, shaking his head. Falling. Elise's heart clenched. You fell from here? He nodded again, his face pale. Do you remember why? She pressed gently. For a moment. He didn't say anything. Then, in a voice so low she almost didn't hear it, he said, someone pushed me. The revelation sent a jolt through Elise. Someone pushed you, she repeated incredulously. He nodded again, his expression distant. Who? Don't, he admitted, his voice cracking. Was dark. I trusted them. The weight of his words hung in the air like a stone. Elise felt a wave of anger for him, but she quickly suppressed it. He didn't need her fury, he needed her support. We'll find out the truth, she said firmly. I promise you. Back at the hospital, Elise delved deeper into the newspaper article and the notes compiled by the social worker. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit. Mr. Dinh had been found unconscious at the bottom of the cliffs, and his fall had been classified as an accident. But now, with his revelation, Elise knew it had been no accident. She contacted the local authorities, sharing the limited information they had. To her surprise, the detective assigned to the case was already familiar with the file. We always suspected there was more to this story, explained Detective Hart over the phone. But with no witnesses and no leads, the case went cold. What happens now? Elise asked. If your patient is willing to cooperate, we can reopen the case. Hart replied. But it will take time, and a lot of courage on his part. When Elise explained this to Mr. Dinh, His reaction was mixed. Courage, he murmured, his voice tinged with bitterness. Weak. You're not weak. Elise replied firmly. You survived something most wouldn't have. And now you're fighting to reclaim your life. That's strength. Mr. Din, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Her words seemed to comfort him. But she could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. In the weeks that followed, Mr. Din worked tirelessly to regain his strength. His progress was remarkable. He could now walk short distances with the aid of a cane. And his speech, though still halting, was becoming more fluid each day. Elise remained by his side, her unwavering belief in him fueling his determination. You've come so far, she told him one afternoon as they walked together down the hospital corridors. Thanks to you, he replied, his gratitude shining in his voice. Weeks later, Hart returned with news that would change the course of the case. We found evidence that Derek Hunt, Mr. Din's former business partner, was embezzling funds from the lighthouse restoration project. Hart explained during a meeting with Elise and Mr. Din, it seems you confronted him, and things got out of hand. Witnesses reported seeing you two arguing near the cliffs the night you fell. Mr. Din's jaw tightened. He pushed me, he said, his voice calm despite the tremor in his hands. Hart nodded. We've reopened the case. And Hunt is being investigated. But Mr. Din, we'll need your testimony to move forward. The trial was grueling. But Mr. Din held firm. His testimony, combined with the evidence gathered by Detective Hart, painted a clear picture of Derek Hunt's betrayal. The jury deliberated for less than a day before finding Hunt guilty of attempted murder and financial fraud. When the verdict was read, Mr. Din felt an immense sense of relief. Justice had been served. But more importantly, he had reclaimed his voice. In every sense of the word. The day Mr. Din, now known as Evan Cole, thanks to the rediscovery of his identity, left the hospital, Elise helped him pack his belongings. The room that had once felt sterile and empty was now filled with the memories of transformation and hope. You're free, Elise said, smiling as she handed him the postcard of the lighthouse. Evan took the postcard, his fingers gently tracing the image. Thanks to you, he said, his voice strong and filled with gratitude. Months passed. Though Elise continued to be busy at the hospital, she often thought of Evan and his incredible journey. One day, a letter arrived in her mailbox. Inside, she found a photo of Evan standing in front of the Arbor View Lighthouse, the restored beacon gleaming in the sun. It was accompanied by a note, written in Evan's own hand. Elise, thank you for being my light in the darkness. Thanks to you, I found my way home. Evan. Elise placed the photo on her desk, a smile of pride lighting up her face. Evan's journey had been one of pain, resilience, and redemption, and she felt honored to have been a part of his story.